Samo, welcome to the program.
It's good to be here with you.
Why don't you, so just to start, if you could just tell our listeners a little bit about your background and what you do what is Bismarck Analysis, that sort of thing.
For the last 10 years, I've been thinking about society, and I've undertook many historical investigations, including, various research into disparate fields, everything from archaeology to how large organizations make decisions. And sort of the guiding star in this process, which really was a quest to try to, understand human history on a deep level, as a guiding star was this sort of idea that human nature has certain constancies, right? While technologies might change and in fact can transform us to very significant degrees, while ideologies can change, religions can change, there are some commonalities across human structure. So it's possible to both learn something by, looking at how the pharaohs handled their bureaucracy about the modern day, as it is possible to learn something about the ancient past by looking at a modern organization. This was obviously very, very theoretical work. I have a number of historical articles that your listeners can find. All of my essays and articles and papers are collected on samoburja.com /essays. So they can go dig into those, some interesting topics there. However, about 4 or so years ago, actually 5 years, it's in 2017, I realized that some of these studies, I think, could just be applied directly to the economy, hopefully in a way that's, economically productive, or in a way that could, possibly even help governments or philanthropists. So the idea came for Bismarck Analysis. Before that, I had worked at various research nonprofits. I envisioned it as a sort of for-profit consulting firm. I intended it to stay relatively small, but basically have really this team of people with diverse views who, however, would know how to argue with each other. Because I think the real bane of social sciences is kind of the confirmation bias, where people see what they want to see and they don't know what they don't know. So sort of the unknown unknowns and wishful thinking together sort of conspire to always create these very ideological echo chambers. And argument today is almost a synonym for fighting. But I think that there's a very much a living, hopefully, art of coming to speak to someone you deeply disagree with and gleaning insight from the other person's positions, even if you don't end up changing their mind, and even if it doesn't make for a good performance for an audience. Unfortunately, I feel sort of Twitter is currently the best online space we have for debate, but Twitter basically is almost a gladiatorial ring where you are rewarded for entertaining the audience rather than for gleaning insight from the position of someone you might disagree with. Further, I think that having a perspective on a society that's very different from your own often can help you figure things out. So from 2017 onward, the company's developed quite a bit. It's named Bismarck because I was a big fan of the historical figure, Otto von Bismarck, who I think invents essentially the modern state, the modern political compromise, and was a great statesman, worked in many different domains, everything from foreign policy to social policy, very successful, but also came to, over time, acquire this kind of reputation for realism. So my thinking has been over the last few years that insofar as the company plays also a positive role for the general public, we will, as far as we can, release some of these reports, some of these case studies, some of these recommendations that originally are developed for paying clients to the general public with the hope that even this kind of dispassionate non-advocacy analysis finds some use out there. I really think that if we were to more deeply study society, the place we all obviously spent all of our lives in, and I think if we as a society overall engaged in more constructive self-reflection, more intentional reverse engineering of the different social technologies that surround us, I think that such a culture would be much more capable of tackling some of the challenges that we face.
Okay, so my impression, and I have followed your work or whatever for a number of years, not always in depth, but I associate you with two kind of big ideas or concepts or theories. One is the great founders theory, and then there's another one that we can get to in a minute. But maybe we can talk a little bit. What is the great founders theory or great founders? What is this idea?
Great founder theory could be considered a type of great man history. What is great man history? It is the view that history is made by sort of the pivotal decisions of exceptional individuals, right? That these people's achievements come to shape history, the great artists, the great scientists, the great general, and so on. Great founder disagrees with this older school of history. Great founder, great man history was very much the default and sort of popular in the 19th century, but it over time came to be replaced by a sort of view where society is shaped by forces and trends that are fundamentally impersonal. I would basically take on board a lot of these developments of the last 150 years of social science, and I would say, yes, definitely trends, forces, sort of widespread distributed belief systems, economic fundamentals, even, sort of the fundamental pressures of our material technology reshaping our society in its own way. I think these all are just very much influential. They matter. But I think that there is still room for agency in history. I don't really think that there are that many meaningful decisions that people can make about sort of the course of human history due to a fortuitous circumstance. However, I think that there are periods of great social technology innovation where completely new modes of doing politics, completely new modes of religious life, social norms, laws, completely new organizations arise, right? Institutions that sometimes last for hundreds or even thousands of years. It's good to remember that the University of Oxford has been in existence for longer than the rise and fall of Aztec civilization. So nearly 1,000 years, right?
Yeah.
And then, depending on how you date the Catholic Church, it's been around for about 2,000. And around the world, there are many monasteries that are many hundreds of years old, though I would argue, of course, that monasteries, any individual monastery has shaped the world less than, the Catholic Church or the University of Oxford or, the imperial family of Japan. So these very long-lived institutions come into existence with particular individuals or very small groups of people, setting them up, bringing them into existence, and then they live a life in the ecosystem of human institutions for centuries, millennia, exerting a force on society overall. In a way, I said any individual monastery, for example, might not have a big impact on society. However, monasticism has a very big impact on society. So easily a founder of a monastic order could come to be a great founder. Am I saying that every person that sort of, creates a company today or a country 400 years ago, am I saying that any of these is this kind of history shaping great founder? No, I actually wouldn't say that. I essentially define great founders as those who really can impact history on the truly civilizational level. So, if I were to give a few interesting examples, I would probably give, let's say a more martial political example, which would probably be Charlemagne, where I think Charlemagne actually weaves together the threads of the remnant of sort of the Roman state or the organized religion of the Roman state and these, very barbarous, essentially Germanic peoples ruling over a somewhat Latinized Gallic underclass, and that sort of brings into existence feudalism as we might think of it, this kind of division between state and church as we might think of it, brings a revival of Latin and Roman law, in addition to sort of the spread of the Catholic Church itself, and it sets Western civilization on this path that it's been on for basically 1,500 years. On the completely other side of the Eurasian landmass, and a very different example, I would say that Confucius, not through personal success, but through the success of the school of thinkers that he directly founded, right? His students were basically trained by Confucius to become advisors to rulers and to reform what had been a hereditary system of nobility into a meritocratic and, at least in theory, humane system of merit based bureaucracy that respected sort of the ancient tradition of the Zhao dynasty and so on, or at least what it believed to be that tradition. So Confucian philosophy as such has arisen numerous times in the history of China over the last 2,000 years. And this change, right, this sort of introducing a particular school of thought, finding a good socioeconomic niche for it, that of basically court advisors, giving it a set of ethics. Yes, in fact, ethics can be, not just something that makes us behave as better human beings. It's also something that can make groups of people much more effective. It gave them the tools to be a persistent factor in the courts of Chinese society, right? And Chinese imperial society was surprisingly centralized. So, in a way, the Confucian theory that, kind of reform starts nearby and radiates outward proved very much true, where changes that were at first these weird affectations of these weird scholars at court eventually radiated out and came to define much of Chinese culture and much of Chinese civilization, but also impacted the political balance of power within China on a very, very profound level. These might seem to be like relatively small shoves from each of these, both, Charlemagne and Confucius, but they are ones that multiplied over time, not diminished, and the institutions they planted and the descendants and copies of these institutions, together with the social technologies that were introduced, these both came to be very much civilization defining. And I don't think either of them really is replaceable. I think in the absence of Charlemagne, not only would the politics of what today would become France and Germany be very different, I think the eventual social compact might be extremely different as well. We might have seen very much tribal or clannish societies rather than feudal societies that were eventually set on the track to building these type of early modern states come to dominance. And were it not for the Confucian perspective in China, we might have seen a very different philosophy, say the legalist philosophy, or perhaps even a reversion to hereditary rule at all levels of government, not just with the imperial family, produce a very different China.
Is great founders, are they something that can only be really identified in retrospect and only after like hundreds of years or however long it takes for the thing to play out, or is it something that you can kind of, at least to some degree, say, looking forward, this person or group, is potentially a great founder. This is not. Are there criteria like that you might apply?
Well, I think that there are a number of prerequisites for being a great founder. One of them is innovating in a relevant new social technology. When it comes to social technologies, it can be quite difficult to really figure out what works or what doesn't in the short run. However, anything that sort of is kind of unique and really manages to work tends to work fairly quickly. We have many examples of these historical movements that over the course of a few decades completely transform society. Say the spread of Christianity in the late Roman Empire, or to pick a more controversial example, the success of early 20th century Marxist-inspired revolutionaries. Whatever one thinks, say, of Marxist-Leninist revolutionaries in the early half of the 20th century, they were extremely adept at carrying out revolutions, the sort of Leninist vanguard party theory. Though, today obviously we wouldn't think of that as the start of a civilization. Why? Because, well, in 1991, we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union. If you checked encyclopedias in, what was it? I think 1973, I think it might even have been the Encyclopedia Britannica. You would have a list of the 10 most impactful people in the world, in human history, all of human history. And the list was Jesus. No, actually, it was Muhammad, Jesus, and Karl Marx. I guarantee you that if we were writing that article today, we wouldn't list Karl Marx. Why? Because it was not the beginning of 1,000-year sort of tradition of statehood or social philosophy. It was not something comparable to Confucianism or even something comparable to some of the other profound social philosophies that shaped the world and religions. But in 1973, that certainly seemed plausible. So my answer would be, to your question of can we tell if someone is going to be a great founder, I think first we have to see whether they're engaged in a certain type of social innovation or renewal. Are they creating institutions? Do they have direct disciples, people who have worked with them, studied with them, learned from them, that view themselves as carrying on their tradition? And finally, are they a live player? And if the answer to all four of those is yes, the odds are still low, but they're not that low. They're something like, 5% maybe, 10% maybe. I think that there have been probably a few thousand at most people who, through all of human history, through all of its civilizations, I would sort of class as a great founder. But these four criteria are met far less frequently than people might assume.
Yeah, so I think that leads into my next question pretty well, which is the other idea that known for the live player, dead player, or live player, non NPC. It's not exactly your terminology, but
It's not quite my term, but it's very evocative, right? It's
yes, right,
it's a very relatable way to rephrase it. Well, I had this essay a few years ago that's become quite popular since, titled "Live versus Dead Players," and in it I noted that for all of the sort of exquisite expertise, knowledge, formidable tactics that some of the most competent people in the world display, almost all of them are working off of someone else's playbook, off of someone else's script. Now, the script, might have been contributed to by many, many people. But, the moves they take, what they do, it's just a well executed rendering of something that's already been done. Unusually, though, you sometimes find people who seem to be able to do things anew, who seem to be able to sometimes even jump expertise. You have these really strange careers of some individuals where they're going to be world class performing not in one domain, but in two or three domains. To give a funny example, right? Someone who I don't think is a great founder, but I think is a very accomplished man. Arnold Schwarzenegger first was sort of a bodybuilding champion. Then he, became an actor, and then he became a politician. And at each point, people scoffed why someone from the previous group would ever imagine that they would do well, right? Uh, you know, when he first starred in blockbuster movies, people are just like, yeah, this is just a bodybuilder. He doesn't know how to act. By the time he became governor of California, people, of course, said he's just an actor. He doesn't know how to be, a governor or a politician. So I guess winning at politics forced critics to go, back to calling him, forced critics to acknowledge that he had been a successful actor before.
Yeah, they should have
Um,
learned. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but
no, of
you think they
course,
would have learned the lesson about the connection between acting and politics by then? But go
no, they
ahead.
hadn't. They
Yeah,
somehow hadn't, right? Despite the successful example of Ronald Reagan, right, the most successful American politician of the 1980s. Today, of course, it's an observation that's almost boring. Though I'm going to note today, you actually have very few actors who succeed super well in politics. It seems that they just mostly choose to stay actors.
yeah. The only, I mean, I guess the most recent contemporary example would be someone like Zelensky, who,
Yes, President Zelensky of Ukraine.
yeah,
Um, and, perhaps that's one of the reasons that Ukraine has overperformed what was expected of Ukraine. People were seriously considering that Zelensky might just flee the country in the first 48 hours of the war. I think perhaps over inferring from the example of Afghanistan, right? In the Afghanistan example, the government did flee fairly quickly after US withdrawal and after sort of the Taliban started making significant advances on the capital.
yeah.
So
Well,
Zelensky's adaptability, right? His adaptability and resourcefulness perhaps was on display. And because of that, he might have had the confidence to, deal with something that for a Ukrainian politician was unprecedented. There had never been an invasion of this scale in the post-Soviet environment. So if you were a typical Eastern European politician, you probably, you certainly would have felt overwhelmed.
so one characteristic, so live player, they don't just operate according to scripts. They're able to move in ways that seem kind of unpredictable and even baffling to people who are used to following scripts. And I guess they also potentially that helps them succeed in multiple different domains because they can do it over and over again. That it's basically the idea.
Well, there's very little variance in what they do. They do what they do very well. If you want to think about it, it's sort of the difference perhaps between, a composer and a rote performer, or perhaps the difference between an inspired performer, musician, and someone that just does execute the standard thing very competently. I think a live player essentially is someone that's not working off a script. Now, so why do I call it a live player versus a dead player? Well, for a dead player, you can read their book. You know exactly what they're going to do. Uh, at a very significant level of competition, they just will reliably be radically outcompeted by live players. And for whatever reason, this distribution seems fairly binary and it doesn't quite track intelligence, right? So you can have a very intelligent individual and they're a dead player. Or you can have an organization that is an extremely powerful, wealthy organization, but is a dead player and can't adapt to the emergence of a new competitor, right? The whole Silicon Valley concept of disruption is that a small, nimble team will run circles around an old incumbent tech giant and eventually replace them. Today, of course, the last round of startups have themselves become tech giants. But when companies like Google, Facebook, and so on, when they were getting started, they were dealing with these giants of the previous generation, right? Microsoft, and even before that, companies like IBM and so on.
I hesitate to use this terminology because it has a lot of modern connotations that make it easy to misunderstand. But I'm going to do it anyway. So the ancients, they said that there were basically three forms of government. It's monarchy, rule by one person, oligarchy, rule by a few or elite, and then democracy, rule by the many. And one, as I was thinking about some of, the live player, dead player, and then even a little bit great founders, it sort of struck me that live players tend to be, individuals or have like a monarchical aspect, not necessarily kings, but people who are, individual decision makers, right, in whatever their institutional organization is. And then the dead players or other institutions that are going by rote, they seem to be much more, bureaucratic. And while you can't have like a single individual in charge, it seems like is more likely to happen if you had like an established institution that where no single person was in charge, is more oligarchical. Would you say that that's accurate? Can you have live player oligarchies or groups, that are beyond, not like 5 people or whatever, but like an actual institution?
Well, I would usually say that, and I kind of stand by this, for a large organization to be a live player, right, to display this kind of adaptability, I think that has to be the product of a relatively small group of people working together.
Yeah, I've noticed in organizations, even the difference between, say, a dozen people and 30 people, in terms of, just the basic, like with a dozen people, sometimes you'll have an organization that is very vibrant, dynamic, and very adaptable or whatever. And then even when you get up to like 30 people, that starts to become somehow unworkable, and like, bureaucratic norms and others just start to come into play really quick. So I guess, I mean, size, obviously you can have a really large organization that's just run by, where like you have a single guy at the top or a couple people at the top. But anything more than that, I think it's, maybe there's something about the structure of it that you just can't do that, with like a hive mind, I guess. That wasn't exactly a question, but I don't know if you.
No, it's good. It's good to engage and interrogate these ideas like deeply. I think that there are fundamental constraints on coordination between people. Look, the more stakeholders you have, the harder it is to reach consensus, right? You can maybe reach consensus on a course of action with one person, maybe again with 5 people. With 10 people, I guarantee someone, if a consensus is seemingly reached, someone's already biting their tongue. Someone's already going along, right? So with 10 people, I don't think you can actually achieve genuine consensus anymore. And even for something like a majority decision, the larger the group of people you bring the decision in front of, well, the longer the debate around the decision is likely to take, the longer it'll take for people, to sort of stop exchanging, to sort of reach that decision. It's necessarily a much slower system. Not everyone's even going to be interested in all of the decisions that would have to be made for such a large group of people, right? If, I'm making the decisions for my own life, I'm intimately familiar with that. If I make decisions for 1,000 people, I'm much less familiar with what their lives are like, and, tasked with considering questions that impact millions and millions of people. It just starts to get this overwhelming mass of information, this overwhelming sheer quantity of decisions, right? And then necessarily these decisions have to be delegated away from the larger group to subgroups. Why do I talk about this? Well, it's a very common assumption that sort of in the absence of structures, in the absence of these societal organizations, maybe in a state of sort of perfect freedom, people could just, collectively always make decisions by consensus. That there could be this sort of idealized utopian way in which organizations can function. And for the most part, that seems to not be true. And for the most part, what we're stuck with is picking between different forms of hierarchy, different methods of delegation, different balances of power, right? Because again, there is always the possibility of escalation, be it in a modern organizational context, maybe legal escalation, in the, Bronze Age, in the Bronze Age context, possibly the battle axe, right? These are all very real factors that then feed back into what are stable, effective, or even viable, right? Merely can be brought into existence forms of social organization.
Okay, so we've been talking at a very abstract level. I think it would be good to maybe bring it down a little bit, talk about some examples, and apply what these principles there. So, and I have a couple things that have been, in recent news of various degrees of importance. But Elon Musk, right? So we're talking about. I believe you've identified Elon Musk as like a live player. He's currently involved in an attempt to buy Twitter, take it private, which seems to instantiate some of these dynamics that you're talking about. Like what would your basic analysis be of Musk and how he relate, Twitter, how they relate to all this?
Well, I think if Musk succeeds in a hostile takeover of Twitter, this will be an important precedent for how modern American corporate governance works. The reason is today, it usually is the case that, a software giant starts with a founder. The founder hires people who hire people who hire people. And eventually the founder sort of loses control of the company. And then it's at best governed by corporate best practices. It sort of becomes slowly enmeshed with government. And on the other hand, it sort of perhaps becomes more responsible, more responsive, less disruptive, and probably that's good once you start talking about companies that are $100 or $200 billion or $300 billion. However, if Musk takes over Twitter, I think he's sort of crazy enough to actually cut the fat. I think we might actually see a very different Twitter. And I honestly find the prospect exciting. I find it an exciting experiment to run because we actually don't know what's going to happen and this is not going to surprise you, I think Elon Musk is a live player, someone that takes unpredictable moves, that sort of knows how to, think about his environment, navigate it. He also has shown an ability and an awareness of basically large societal trends that he can hop between or make use of. So I think he might be one of the few people that could navigate Twitter into becoming something radically different than it is right now. I don't think it's going to be his main focus, though. So if I were to make sort of like a very tentative prediction, because he's already stretched so thin with several other companies, and to be fair, in some of these companies, he's done remarkable delegation, right, where has truly excellent people doing the day-to-day work. I expect he might thin the number of employees at Twitter significantly, bringing a few more people, and then just set very different standards for Twitter. And this might bring Twitter onto a collision course with government. I think it's not just Twitter on its own making some of these relevant decisions. I think Twitter has had a very productive partnership with various political organizations in the United States, but just also directly with the US government. We even know this from the leaked Snowden emails back in the day that Twitter was essentially coordinating with the US State Department for how it can best assist regime change during the Arab Spring. I see no reason for that type of collaboration to have stopped. I only know that the actually, I think they went out the Snowden emails, the Assange emails. I misspoke. It's been a few years.
Yeah, there was
yeah.
stuff.
Well, Julian Assange is
Yeah.
in prison now, we assume. So no more Assange emails. But just because there are no emails, we shouldn't expect that this sort of coordination between some of the biggest organizations in society has stopped.
Yeah, I think that there was some stuff in the Snowden documents about Twitter, but that was more
as well.
That was about the spot
surveillance stuff.
Yeah, domestic surveillance. Yeah, yeah. It is kind of odd to contemplate that the same person is in charge or founded the most successful electric vehicle company, most successful private spaceflight company. Had the whole role in the PayPal thing, and now might also do Twitter as well. I don't know when he sleeps, but what so another. All right, so if you have more comments on this, you can. But I was gonna pivot to another person who has been in the news. I don't know. I actually don't know exactly how you would classify him, but I'm talking about Vladimir Putin. Obviously, recent events have taken us to a place that a few years, possibly even a few months ago, I think the general attitude was, large scale land wars are kind of a old 20th century thing. They're extinct, at least certainly if we're talking about in Europe, other things like that. I mean, what's your? I know you've written a lot about Russia, developments and modernizations in the Russian military and strategy, other things like that. But what's your analysis of Putin and what he's thinking in terms of the invasion, other stuff like that?
Well, I think that what we are seeing is a continuation of frozen conflicts unfreezing. I think the fact that we had not had major wars in Europe for such a long time was first a result of this, quite literally frozen conflict, this Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, followed after 1991 by US hegemony. As the United States, in some ways, in some parts of the world, weakens, such as was the case in Afghanistan, where after the withdrawal, the Afghani government collapsed very quickly, there are powers that have a revisionist approach where they sort of want to reassert their old existing spheres of influence. For Russia itself, it's sort of been Putin's mission to stop its decline as a political world power. And if your perspective then is that you're, seeking to maintain Russia's power in the world, then it's obvious that Ukrainian membership in NATO is simply unacceptable. This would make it so that a hypersonic missile could fly from Ukraine to Moscow in a matter of minutes, hitting the capital and possibly even carrying a nuclear payload. The balance of power doesn't actually have to be exercised in order to shape the world. The entire Cold War was everyone tiptoeing around two absolutely massive nuclear arsenals and never actually blowing these arsenals up. Since this I think has been sort of forgotten after 1991, Russia lost most of the aspects of empire, most of the aspects of being sort of this superpower, but it did keep its nuclear arsenal. And there's been sort of a prioritization to keep that. Further, then there's the historic experience of Russia being in this very vulnerable geographic area, which has conversely driven sort of Russian imperialism and expansion and conquest of neighboring territories, be they in Central Asia, be it near the Baltic Sea, Poland, various places like this, in search essentially of geographical anchors, right? Natural barriers like the Carpathian Mountains, for example, or the Caspian Sea, or the Arctic Sea, natural barriers to invasion to make it much easier to defend the vast territory, right? Catherine the Great, there was a saying attributed to Catherine the Great that my borders are so vast that the only way I can think of to defend them is to expand them, right? It's very much indefensible in a very real way, and perhaps maybe depending on how one thinks of imperialism in its own way. But the United States, in its own history, I think practiced manifest destiny and expanded westward until it hit a natural barrier, right, the Pacific Ocean. And once you're anchored on geographic barriers, then this sort of security argument for imperialism kind of goes away. Putin ultimately might have miscalculated in underestimating the strength of Ukraine and the developments in Ukraine since 2014. 2014 is when sort of the first Russian intervention happened, and they successfully annexed Crimea, which has to be admitted was sort of a victory for Russia in terms of power, right? It was the annexation of Crimea that allowed them to exercise naval supremacy in the Black Sea in sort of the first few weeks of this 2022 war. But in the aftermath of this, Ukraine has focused on training their troops, on arming them, on developing strong ties to the Western world. The Western world is very interested in supporting Ukraine and is now sending significant arms shipments, significant financial aid. And it seems that this was put to good use. So 8 years later, Ukraine has possibly become a true nation state with a relatively strong army. However, on the other hand, I do think that Vladimir Putin has been very agile at reforming Russian institutions. I note that he has changed the commanders of Russian forces in recent weeks. I would not at all be surprised if this ends up being a learning experience for the Russian military, where something that looked excellent on paper is sort of debugged, ironed out, put into practice, prototyped. If Russia wins this war through the course of the next year, the next 2 or 3 years, I don't think they're going to allow an independent Ukraine. I think they're going to try to merge it in some way into some entity centered on Russia. Maybe it'll be the Eurasian Union. Maybe it'll be the so-called Union State that already exists on paper between Belarus and Russia. Or maybe it'll be a completely new entity. But the goal, regardless, will be sort of to reform this Russian state. And sort of the bad news for Russia's neighbors is that the Russian military will likely be much more effective in a future war. And if I were to speculate, I think in the long run, say Kazakhstan certainly must perceive the Russian war with mixed feelings. The current president was basically kept in power just a few months ago by Russian troops entering the country and bolstering his government. So in a way, he owes Putin a favor. But on the other hand, he must understand that some of the same geopolitical arguments that have driven Putin to, in the name of sort of national greatness and national security, invade Ukraine, some of these same arguments could potentially apply to Kazakhstan. And military force might be used to make it so that Kazakhstan has sort of less autonomy than it once had.
Yeah, and they do not seem like they. I mean, who knows? But I don't know that they have their own Zelensky or their own certainly weapons pipeline, other support like Ukraine has gotten. So that would be an interesting scenario. I did have one thing that kind of occurred to me earlier. I wanted to ask you about, and then if you don't really have any formed thoughts on it, you can always cut it. But thinking about, so you're talking about you got interested in like grand sweep of history, studying about that, and there have been history. There's been a lot of progress or development, but there've been at least two instances of kind of long-term collapse, dark ages. How you analyze them, how they come about, what, if anything, looking forward, what lessons or other things from the previous collapses might be applicable to today, right? I'm not asking like, should I be buying gold or whatever, but from a scholarly civilizational point of view.
Well, civilizational collapse is sort of, as far as I can tell, almost an inevitable feature of civilizations. I don't think there's ever been, an immortal human civilization. They all seem to have had this run and eventually are destroyed by a variety of factors. We could talk a little bit about why this happens, right? Like with the Bronze Age collapse, the fall of the Roman Empire, the end of the civilization in India associated with the Mohenjo-daro sites, the collapse of Han Dynasty China, and so on and so on. But really, sort of from an almost individual perspective, the best one can expect sort of is the best one can expect and one should try to do is to sort of invest in some of the frontiers of society that continue to grow through a collapse, right? And yes, when a society is undergoing convulsion, there seem to be very few opportunities, but sometimes at the very periphery of a civilization, either geographic or mimetic, new things happen. Previously we were discussing the monastic traditions and the introduction of monasteries. Well, in the Roman context, at least, monasteries were an adaptation to a civil society and public life that was becoming more and more chaotic and dangerous, combined with a rural life that was just as dangerous because of the migrating peoples, the Germanic peoples, and so-called barbarians like the Huns and so on. And people who wanted to sort of practice this Christian faith and take refuge from the world would gather together in these monasteries that ended up becoming these very interesting new institutions that turned out to be intellectually and economically very important for the next 1,000 years. So it might not have seemed like an amazing opportunity, but I think that if civilization or society around you seems to be in decay, seems to be sort of risk of some kind of collapse, depending on your political spectrum, either driven out of kind of institutional decay or perhaps driven by something like the climate crisis, the best thing you can do probably is sort of invest in any new developments that might be happening despite this, sort of new modes of social organization, things that owe nothing to the previous system, but might endure into the next one.
Okay. If people want to learn more, they can go to your website. You have a Substack. If they want to sign up you have a newsletter. I think it's the Bismarck Brief. Where can they go to sign up for that?
Right. If anyone in the audience would like to sign up to the Bismarck Brief, it's a weekly in-depth investigation of either a country, an organization, or an industry. We did a brief on the future of the photovoltaics industry. We did a brief on sort of the struggle for political supremacy in the Mediterranean between France and Turkey. We also did a brief on the likely future evolution of drones and warfare, and so on and so on. The newsletter can be found at brief.bismarckanalysis.com. The back end is Substack. So if you have, if your information's in Substack,